All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I want to first say a big, huge thank you to the symposium organizers and all those working behind the scenes to bring this event together. We know that there are a lot of moving parts, and we just want to say thank you. We see you and we appreciate your labor. My name is Shirley Moody-Turner. I am the founding co-director with Gabrielle Foreman of the new Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University, which we affectionately call DigBlack. Since our presenters will be speaking about the work that led them to the center, I wanted to start by just saying a couple words about the center and to provide some context for the three presentations today. The mission of DigBlack is to work in collaborative, public, and scholarly projects to bring the buried and scattered histories of early Black organizing to digital life. DigBlack is committed to building future generations of Black scholars who will work in higher education, libraries, archives, community-based organizations, museums, and beyond to advocate for social justice and Black rights. The center includes three major projects: the award-winning Color Conventions Project, Douglas Day, and the soon-to-launch Black Women's Organizing Archive. The center is comprised of a core team that includes graduate student leaders, scholars, librarians, undergrad researchers, and postdocs. So our panelists today include three of our center team leaders who are going to talk a little about their different points of entry into the work of the center. For each of them, this began in various ways through their work with the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project, which launched in 2017 with a partnership with the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. After working with the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center to digitize Anna Julia Cooper's papers, we partnered with the Color Conventions Project's Douglas Day event, which is co-directed by Jim Casey and Denise Berger. Douglas Day was founded by Jim Casey to celebrate Frederick Douglass's birthday and engage audiences in a global transcribe-a-thon to shape and preserve Black records. And so I wanted to give just a little bit of context because each of our panelists will be talking about their various work in relation to some of those projects. So first, Justin Smith is going to start us off with a presentation that talks about how the Anna Julia Cooper Digital Project and Douglas Day work together to engage audiences in a crowdsourced transcription of Anna Julia Cooper's digital archive. His paper is titled Technology, Community, and Black Women's Archives, Engaging Anna Julia Cooper Through Douglas Day 2020. Next, Courtney Murray will share her presentation for Colored Girls of the South, Genealogy, Sexual Assault, and Black Women's Rights in Anna Julia Cooper's Writings, asking us to consider how close and careful attention to often lost or overlooked aspects of the archives expands how we think about Black women's experiences and how the personal aspects of Black women's lives are indeed political spaces from which they can and do theorize and organize. Finally, Sabrina Evans will share how working across digital archives can lead to new insights into the politics and practice of Black women's publishing and intellectual productivity. And I just wanted to end on an alliteration, so there it is. Her paper is titled From Crowdsourced Transcriptions to Print Publication, Expanding the Legacy of Anna Julia Cooper. And Sabrina will be talking about how working across both the Moorland archives and the In Her Own Right archives has led to new insights on Anna Julia Cooper's publishing practice. I want to just make one housekeeping note. Please feel free to pose questions throughout the presentations. If you can just put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, use the Q&A feature. Feel free to ask questions. You don't have to wait till the end. You can start populating that right away, but we'll wait to the end to read your questions and pose them to the panelists. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin Smith.
Thank you very much. Yes, as Dr. Moody-Turner said, my paper is called Technology, Community, and Black Women's Archives. Could probably go to the next slide. It's just a title slide. Okay. Preparing Anna Julia Cooper's documents for transcription was a large undertaking involving many people. It would not have been possible without the efforts of Howard University's Moorland-Spingarn Research Center to first preserve and then digitize her papers, all of which took place before I even knew what Douglas Day was, let alone had joined the team. My involvement began in the summer of 2019 at a workshop at Howard University to learn about the Zooniverse transcription platform, which I will discuss further in a moment. My comments today are not meant to reflect all the work that goes into a project as large as Douglas Day, but instead offer some insights into what my work in African American studies and digital humanities has taught me about the possibilities of digital media for making Black women's histories accessible. I will focus my comments through the lens of Zooniverse's workflow functionality because the workflows represent a vital step in determining what data we get from the process. We can only get data for questions that we actually ask, and therefore it is important to think through what we want to know about the documents in order to best make them knowable for future audiences. Firstly then, what is Zooniverse? Zooniverse is a crowdsourcing platform that allows researchers to upload documents that participants can then access. Zooniverse gives researchers a lot of flexibility in terms of what they want participants to do with the documents by virtue of the workflow feature. While the main activity of the crowdsourcing project involved transcribing, researchers can ask participants to answer any number of questions, which might involve looking for specific words or images, highlighting parts of the document, answering questions about the appearance of the document, or nearly anything else. This freedom then creates choices for researchers. The central constraint then becomes balancing three main questions, each of which I will dedicate the rest of the talk to addressing individually. The three questions are, what can the crowdsourcing platform do? What questions do you as a researcher want answered? And what can you reasonably expect participants to contribute? In terms of what the platform can do, Zooniverse was particularly flexible, which can be both good and bad, as the flexibility of Zooniverse necessarily raises questions about what data we wanted. Obviously, we wanted transcriptions, but Zooniverse has what are called workflows that allow you to answer other types of questions as well. For example, we asked about legibility as a way of directing users to different questions that could help them transcribe. So if you advance the slide, you'll see an example of what the initial workflow will look like. Yeah, so there you see, you'll see the document on the left side, and then on the right side, it asks you questions, and this would be the first one, would be, is it typed, handwritten, both, or neither? And then depending on how you answer that question, it will lead you down separate unique paths of questions depending on that. So for example, handwritten documents involved more questions about legibility than printed documents, which tended to be well preserved and in a clear type that did not lend itself to difficulty in reading. An additional choice was deciding how many times we wanted each document to be transcribed before it was retired or no longer visible to participants. We chose to allow 3 transcriptions for each document, which accomplished a few things for us. While we used a software that automatically aggregated the transcriptions, Dr. Jim Casey and myself did spend some time manually going through transcriptions, and I indeed noticed that sometimes only one of the 3 transcriptions was complete. Other times, one transcriber may have mistranscribed a word that the other 2 caught. Sometimes all 3 disagreed, but I was able to go back and manually see who I thought was likely correct. So I'll have an example on the next slide. And this one, some of them got transcribed more than 3 times for a variety of reasons. So this one actually got transcribed 4 times. But in this letter, Cooper's talking about a dress she saw in a store, which I have underlined the name of the store there. One transcriber read it as Lane Brupento, another as Lane Brypento, another as Lane Brupent, and finally the last one read it as what I believe the text actually says, which is Lane Bryant. Although I think you can sort of see where some of the confusion might come in, but that's why it's helpful to have multiple eyes on it. Beyond this, I think about how those 4 transcriptions represent 4 different people getting to interact with that text instead of just one. We wanted Douglas Day not simply to be a mechanical labor of transcribing as many documents as possible so that we as academics could then hoard the information for ourselves. Instead, we wanted to give people a chance to interact with the documents, often producing data that we could not capture in what they gained from their own engagement with these artifacts of Black women's history that do not get nearly the attention they deserve. The next question is to decide what we wanted to accomplish as researchers. We were committed to accurately transcribing as much of Cooper's writing as we could, which we decided meant that if users found the text damaged or otherwise difficult to transcribe, we wanted that to show up in our data so that we could target it for extra care, possibly bringing in people with more expertise on particularly tricky documents. Hence, the questions about legibility not only helped users feel freer to transcribe difficult text, but also became a potentially important data point for us. In general, we wanted to think about what might get lost by simply employing more mainstream transcription practices that do not account for Cooper's intersectional existence as a Black woman, although I do not pretend that we were necessarily perfect in our efforts, and there are things we might do differently knowing what we know now. Finally, all of this is limited by the question of what we can expect from users, or to put it differently, how to make the crowdsourcing accessible to a wide audience. I do not mean this in the sense that our audience was somehow not capable of producing accurate transcriptions, or that the content of the transcriptions would somehow be too difficult for them. On the contrary, many of the participants were incredibly knowledgeable about either Cooper herself, or at least the things she was talking about in her letters and articles, and these participants generated profound insights and questions as they read through her material. In particular, members of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, of which Cooper was also a member, showed up to participate on Douglas Day, and I had conversations with people about why Cooper was visiting certain universities or how to create accent marks on the keyboard as they attempted to transcribe her French materials. On this next slide, you can see the volume of communications we had with participants just on Zooniverse, and so you'll see on February 14th on the left side is that huge spike there where we're engaged with them, and people are making comments throughout all the way up until that next spike on March 27th, which is as we were nearing completion of all the transcriptions. And many of these comments asked technical questions about using the site, but some also commented on interesting finds or inquired about specific documents, as you can see on this next slide, where I've just taken a screenshot of a couple. This first one, someone's commenting that one of the articles mentions that she was the first Negro woman twice in a row, and they were obviously impressed by that, and they had a little happy face. And then the next one, someone's reading a document in French, and they're just noting that there's some parts that are a little bit unclear in the legibility, but is trying to confirm if it's talking about slavery. And so you can see some of the comments that we would get that were interested in learning more about the documents or sharing some insights. So instead then, when I talk about the limit of what we can expect from participants, I am largely talking about a technological limit. It can be something as simple as how to access the website or how to find something to transcribe once there. One question we had was, as much as we wanted to take advantage of the workflow function of Zooniverse, how many questions could we reasonably expect our participants to answer, especially when they were there to transcribe, and many of them with perhaps only a limited window on a brief break from work or class. Again, with more time, we might have tested our workflows more, but we ultimately settled on asking relatively few questions and trying to get people to the actual transcribing as quickly as possible. Douglas Day 2020 wound up being, from our perspective, a success. And this next slide, you can see some of the statistics. So we successfully transcribed all 1,754 of our subjects or documents that we uploaded, with 638 registered participants, and some additional unknown numbers of unregistered participants. And we, like I said, we needed each subject to be transcribed 3 times. So we needed at least 5,262 transcriptions. And we were able to get 4,581 done just on Douglas Day alone. And on this next slide, I think I showed that. Yeah, you can see that those are the number of transcriptions that were being done per day. And again, you see a huge spike there on February 14th, which was Douglas Day, with some activity happening in the days before and after it as well. And then the next slide, I just included some of the tweets that we were sending during the event as we tracked the progress of it. And the tweet on the right is from March 27th, which is when we were able to get all the documents transcribed, and we sent a tweet on that. Some good news in the middle of the pandemic was just starting to hit pretty hard then. So I will conclude with some thoughts on what our data ended up looking like and what lessons we might draw from that. Thus far, we have really only used the data from the transcriptions. This is not completely unexpected since, as I said earlier, the workflow was as much for us to be able to identify tricky documents as it was to assure participants that they need not be able to read every word of a document in order to transcribe it. It will be interesting to compare the data from this year's Douglas Day to last year's and see if there's any difference in how people approach transcriptions given the lack of a workflow. With that said, we still retain the other data we gathered and may be able to make use of them as we make decisions about how to exhibit these documents and how we want to categorize them. We will have a much easier time grouping documents by whether or not they are handwritten or perhaps sectioning off particularly illegible documents for future researchers who may develop ways of recovering what was lost. Or we may be able to create opportunities for people to creatively imagine what these documents might have said as part of the process Sadia Hartman describes as critical fabulation. Such thinking relates to broader questions about how far we can extend the crowdsourcing process and how to involve community members not only in the transcription, but in the processing of the data. We have also begun discussions about what sorts of digital exhibits we will create with this data. One consideration is, of course, maintaining our partnership with institutions such as Howard as we display our results. However, there are more open-ended questions about what we can do with the displays. As just one example, we discussed the possibility that in the future we may ask participants to identify if a document mentions a specific location and use that data to create maps that show Black women's travels. While Douglas Day 2020 was all about Anna Julia Cooper, who is a person we're studying in her own right, I hope these concluding questions have also gestured to the broader concerns of Black women's history and how researchers can both ethically and productively engage with the communities for whom this history can be so personal. Thank you.
Thank you for having us today. And thank you, Justin and Dr. Moody-Turner, for setting up so well for my own presentation. Working from the Color Conventions Project's second principle and the work of Douglas Day that highlight and affirm Black women's labor, collectives, and leadership, I was able to explore Anna Julia Cooper's archive, focusing on the intersections of her professional, political, and personal life, and how they were informed by the collective and distributive approaches of Black feminine labor, community, and relationships. To that end, in this presentation, I investigate how scholars could digitally and visually employ this principle to exhibit Black women's writing and archives, possible research methods to find moments in these Black women's archives when they employed subversive strategies to challenge sexual assault, and how expanding the analytical boundaries of Black women identities and archives can lead to productive interpretations of their legacies. To do this, I turned to Cooper's complicated genealogy and how it may have impacted her advocacy for and writing on Black women's rights. Slide. Common biographical narratives, especially those surrounding Cooper's beginnings, usually define Cooper through her professional and public roles. Anna Julia Haywood Cooper is often associated with monikers such as educator, feminist, activist, administrator, and so on. Louis Daniel Hutchinson and others are examples of this. Interestingly, while these scholars are certain about Cooper being born as Annie, most don't sit long with this name. Other than her enslaved mother, Hannah Stanley Haywood, possibly naming her after a Riley attorney's mother, I wonder why these scholars emphasize Annie over Anna without interrogating its origins. slide. That uninterrogated Annie and those narratives often lead to most critics probing Cooper's allegiance to true womanhood or the true cult of womanhood. These criticisms stem from Cooper's call for motherhood, piety, and domesticity for Black women in her public writings and her presumed elitism. Because of this presumed elitism and the way she evokes domesticity, some earlier scholars wonder if Cooper, characterizing herself as a Black woman from the South, was representative enough for all Black women from the South, including those of the working class. However, the criticisms and narratives risk aligning the impact of Annie's mother being an enslaved domestic servant placed at the lowest rungs of U.S. social hierarchy, her father being her mother's enslaver, and that Cooper herself had worked from age 9 to raise money for her own education. We may know Anna, but who exactly was Annie? What did she contribute to our understanding of Anna? Cooper's birth and childhood are testament to her life being predicated on being a Black woman from the South, a life always threatened by sexual and physical assault, which could lead to non consensual relationships, births, and labor. Slide. For my presentation, I want to focus not just on how sexual assault impacted Cooper's archive, but also how our archive forces a return to that very moment of non consensual conception between enslaver and enslaved, and explore to what extent this visceral, emotional, and even biological moment of Cooper's life influenced what and how she chose to write about it. Through Brittany Cooper's conceptualization of embodied discourse, where the Black body connects with text, mythology, and theory, we can understand why and how Cooper uses Black bodies in her writings. Thus, this is a revised seminar project where I investigate how one can find Cooper's Black bodies in the forms, newspapers, articles, essays, and poetry comprised of her archives. However, I looked for a particular body in her work, the racialized, sexualized, and mixed Black and feminine body. Her uses of her own and others' mixed race and feminine bodies not only contest the tenets of true womanhood, but also expose the fallacies embedded in politics of miscegenation, gender, and U.S. American identity, highlight Black women's long history with sexual assault and abuse, and speculate about Cooper's possible internal struggle with her own identity, being mixed race or colored. Ultimately, I do all of this to call for a continuation of a more humanistic remapping of how we engage with Black women's writing and archives. So next slide, I will talk about the structure of my exhibit. So I use the ArcGIS story map platform to construct an exhibit that foregrounded the sexual assault of Black women during this period more generally. In utilizing this approach, I sought to illustrate the environment that informed the early years of Cooper's life. Looking at the period from 1850s, 1860s, the years surrounding Cooper's birth, I documented stories of women and men, both recognized and lesser known figures, and how they grappled with the impacts of sexual assault. This led me, for example, to Celia, who served several states over, was executed for killing her enslaver for years of rape, as well as those like Harriet Jacobs, Elizabeth Keckley, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass, who all also dealt with the impacts of the sexual assault of Black women. Then, after this brief counter-historical background, I exhibited the documents that fit my research scope. I pointed to particular sections that demonstrate Cooper grappling with her and others' coloredness. On the next slides, I will show the examples that I found. Notes and forms. So this first example comes from a questionnaire titled Negro College Graduates in Individual Occupational History that Cooper filled out circa 1930. I particularly focused on her answers to questions 17, 18, and 19. She claims that she does not know her father's birthplace and later answers the question, what was the attitude of your parents toward your college education? With the answer, I owe nothing to my white father beyond the initial act of procreation. My mother's sacrificing toil to give me advantages she had never enjoyed is worthy of the highest praise and undying gratitude. On the next slide, I'll show another um, example. The second undated example are Cooper's answers to a letter asking her to participate in a study of racial attitudes. She has placed pluses and minuses or T's and L's for statements that she found true or false. Some of the statements have no answers. Lines I focused on were, I would be willing to accept a white person into my family, which she answers is too broad. Another line states, racial intermixture is not biologically injurious, but has bad social consequences, which she leaves blank. Other lines like the Negro does not want intermarriage, but recognition of social equality otherwise, and the result of intermixture Negro as such will ultimately disappear and race problem be solved. and Negroes should remain distinct, race, and separate are also left blank. Interestingly, on the second page, the next statements focus on type of relationship with members of white race, direct contact, and indirect contact. Cooper answers this inquiry by saying, from race relations in the South, stories and anecdotes, survival of childhood memory, and other. These lines are incomplete sentences riddled with spaces and ellipses, specifically focusing on the phrases survival of childhood memory and other, paired with the fragmented nature of the answer connotes a sort of heaviness and hesitancy or space from something surviving from her childhood. In the next slide, I will show an example of her poetry. So Cooper wrote this poem during her years at Lincoln University in Missouri, and the Aunt Charlotte is most likely her dear friend Charlotte Fortin Grimke. The details may relate to Charlotte's mother being the daughter of a North Carolinian white enslaver. The lines I analyzed were, in bondage my mother conceived me, in bondage my first breath I uttered, in bondage my 8 babes I suckled. Even though none of their mothers birthed 8 babies in total, if one were to add Charlotte's mother and her 3 siblings, Charlotte herself, and Cooper alongside her two siblings, all the children born to either enslaved or formerly enslaved women add up to 8. Thus, Cooper seems to use Charlotte's life to write an ode to the enslaved women who sacrificed and birthed them. The next example will show newspapers. In this newspaper clipping, A Confession of Faith, Cooper states that she doesn't want to marry white people, nor that any of her kith and kin should do so. Even more interesting is that Cooper stakes a claim that her American identity because of mixed race status. She argues that her ancestry consists of 3 streams: those who came over in the Mayflower in 1620, those who came over a year earlier in that fateful Dutch trader that put in at Jamestown in 1619, and the vanishing red man, making her a true blue American. In her own words, she eloquently states, while however some may be interested in checking up, testing, measuring, and comparing these 3 strains in the curl of my hair, or the breadth of my nostrils, or the color of my epidermis, myself as a thinking, feeling, willing entity am not the least bit conscious of thinking, feeling, or willing through and by the pigment cells in that epidermis. If different, I don't know it. I am absolutely sure that I am not an alien and could not, even if I wanted to, expatriate myself. The last examples are coming from her published work. This next slide are pages from her seminal work, A Voice from the South. One comes from her essay, Womanhood, a Vital Element in the Regeneration and Progress of a Race, from which comes the origins of the title of this presentation. Here, a more personal anecdote of experience may be heard when she describes the plight of the colored girl of the South who experiences no father to whom they dare apply the loving term, often without a stronger brother to espouse their cause and defend their honor with his life's blood, in the midst of pitfalls and snares, waylaid by the lower classes of white men. The second group of pages are from her essay, Woman versus the Indian, in which readers see a body like hers, but also experience its erasure when she illustrates a cream-colored applicant being denied admission into a woman's culture club because colored people were not admitted to the classes. Here, not only is her womanhood erased because the woman in this sentence represents white women, but the same violence is done when the cream-colored applicant is equal to colored people, not colored women. And lastly, also from the same essay, these pages of the third group show her questioning the legal segregation on trains and wondering where she fits in. The color line actually does not hinder Black people from sitting in the white-only section because the sovereign law of the state is for presumable Caucasians. A few pages later, find Cooper at a dilapidated train station where she writes, I see 2 dingy little rooms with 4 ladies swinging over one and for colored people over the other, while wondering under which head I come. In this moment, Cooper grapples with another moment of hypervisibility and invisibility where her Blackness and womanhood are placed in contestation while her whiteness is completely erased. And I will conclude with my last slide. So I end with this collage to signify how Cooper's public and political work was very much entangled with the personal, meaning Black motherhood and Annie. After examining the moments where Cooper highlights hers and others' ties to coloredness, I return to the question, who is Annie and how does she expand Anna Julie Cooper's legacy? In her more public work, Annie represents a pride centered on her disruptive genealogy and its ties to American identity. Her biological makeup ruptures scientific, political, and social constructs of race and miscegenation and exposes the exclusionary spaces of white feminism, Black essentialism, and US law. However, in her more personal work, the very existence of Annie and those like her unsettled the implicit bias it forms at class by foregrounding the sacrifices and pain of Black mothers and women. But her personal work also, with its inserted silences and poetic form, possibly hit at an Annie still grappling with childhood memories and her own relationship to Black motherhood and sisterhood. By slightly changing my lens and being willing to sit with the uncomfortable parts of Cooper's life, I believe I was able to illustrate a compelling, interpretive, and more comprehensive portrait of Annie Julie Cooper. Black women like Cooper are not just symbols for education and activism, they deserve fully fleshed representations of their lives, activism, and connections. I hope to have shown how projects like these highlight the intricacies and delicacies found in well known, overlooked, and omitted Black women writings, legacies, and archives. Thank you.
All right, well, with that wonderful presentation, I will follow up with continuing to engage with some of the pieces from Douglas Day 2020, as Courtney has. My presentation is entitled From Crowdsourced Transcription to Print Publication, Expanding the Legacy of Anna Julia Cooper. So next slide. Anna Julia Cooper, born in 1858, is most known for her foundational Black feminist text, A Voice from the South, by a Black woman from the South, published in 1892. However, her legacy as a prolific writer, educator, and Black feminist activist extended far beyond 1892, with Cooper writing, teaching, and supporting the education of Black youth and working Black adults up until her passing at 105 years old. For this presentation, I will be focusing on letters and poetry that reflect Cooper's consistent fight to not only get her work published and keep her Black feminist work in print circulation, but also to specifically use poetry to reflect Black experiences. Next slide. By using consolidated transcriptions from Douglas Day 2020, a crowdsourcing project that transcribed the Anna Julia Cooper digital collection at the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, as well as letters Cooper sent to her friend, Anna M. Jackson, which comes from the In Her Own Right archive, I will show how digital projects can further illuminate Cooper's own publication efforts throughout her life and her fight to get her intellectual and creative work read and circulated. In my talk, I also suggest how aggregating Black women's papers across digital archives can advance our understanding of the networks in which Black women's intellectual productivity and organizing work took shape. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin with the letters that Anna Julia Cooper sent to her friend, Anna Margaret Jackson. Anna Margaret Jackson, born in 1848, was a Quaker reformist in New York who was active in the Friends Temperance Union and served on the boards of the Colored Orphan Asylum and the Schofield Normal Industrial School in New York City. Her work speaking out against slavery and racism and support for Black education likely led to her connecting with Cooper. Jackson's correspondence also includes letters to and from Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who both placed barriers against Cooper's educational and professional career. Cooper's first letter to Jackson, written in 1902, suggests that Jackson requested a copy of Cooper's seminal text, A Voice from the South. Cooper responds, quote, "My dear Mrs. Jackson, I send by this mail under separate cover the only copy of A Voice from the South which I have been able to find. Though I have been trying ever since I wrote you, I succeeded only yesterday in securing this. I'm glad to have you accept this with my compliments, to make any use of it as you please. The book has faults, many of which I should be able to correct on a revision of the text. However, such as it is, I send it you with my love. Sincerely yours, Anna J. Cooper," end quote. Cooper's letter to Jackson suggests that 10 years after the initial publication of A Voice from the South, it has gone out of print, and even Cooper is hard-pressed to find a copy. The letter also implies that Cooper was interested in revising it to be published once more. I begin with this letter because it reflects one example of Cooper's struggles to get her work published and keep it in circulation. Further, Cooper is advocating for the continued importance of her Black feminist intellectual perspective. Next slide. Cooper's second letter to Jackson is sent 9 years after this letter and reflects a major transition in Cooper's life and career. Whereas in the first letter, Cooper was writing from M Street High School, later named Dunbar High School, shortly after her being made principal, Cooper is now writing from the Lincoln Institute, the state normal collegiate agricultural and industrial institution for colored youth in Missouri. In the lapse of time between these letters, Cooper has withstood the M Street controversy, in which the DC Board of Education refused to renew her contract as principal for the 1905 to 1906 school year due to pushback to her creating pipelines for her students to Ivy League schools and her emphasis on higher education as a means for uplifting her community. Her views differed from the Booker T. Washingtonian advocacy for vocational education, and thus a campaign commenced to besmirch her name and reputation, leading to her accepting a teaching position at the Lincoln Institute. Cooper's second letter to Jackson reflects her feelings about her dismissal and the controversy surrounding it. Cooper updates Jackson on her life, noting that, and I'll quote at length here, quote, "My work is inspiring and pleasant, and I trust I may be able to do some good in helping to develop and train for useful lives the young people with whom I come in contact. The field of influence is not so large possibly as in Washington, and yet I don't know that that matters so long as we are faithful in whatever sphere we find ourselves according to our opportunities. I confess that the breaking up of my home and the scattering of the Lars and Penates is a part on which I don't like to dwell. I hate people with a grouch, and at the same time fear I am in danger of developing one. In my profession, one doesn't earn a refuge for old age in a new field after having given 20 years of the best of one's ability elsewhere." End quote. Cooper's words reveal some of the anger that lingers from the M Street controversy, but also reflects her determination to continue the work she began at M Street High School, educating Black youth and helping them gain better opportunities via her professional networks and influence. Nevertheless, Cooper's letter highlights the emotional toll her educational philosophy and advocacy took, which led to her being uprooted from her home and impacted her personal relationships. I'd now like to turn to the second part of this letter, in which Cooper reveals that she has enclosed a copy of her poem, Simon of Cyrene, asking for Jackson's opinion and her aid in potentially publishing it in The Outlook, a weekly magazine published in New York City that ran from 1870 to 1935 and printed material on religious, political, and social issues. Cooper writes, quote, "Please advise me. I'm getting a photograph made of a beautiful church window in Washington representing Simon as a Black man bearing the cross. I would like to make a white Easter booklet with illustration to sell afterwards. If this does not weary you, I have written a few others which I shall have typewritten and submit to your criticism." End quote. Cooper's letter reveals her poetic and artistic attention to biblical stories, retold and reimagined to reflect Black people's historical and continued oppression, as well as her determination to disseminate her retelling of these stories. Simon of Cyrene tells the biblical story of the man who helped carry Jesus' cross prior to his crucifixion. While the letter itself does not include Cooper's poem, by turning to Anna Julia Cooper's digital archive at Howard, which was transcribed during Douglas Day 2020, her intentions to re-envision Simon of Cyrene's story as part of Black history is made more clear. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see a Microsoft Excel sheet, which includes the data pulled from the Douglas Day transcriptions of Cooper's poetry. During Douglas Day, in order for a document to be marked as complete, it had to have been transcribed 3 times. In working with Dr. Moody-Turner on the Penguin Portable Anna Julia Cooper edition, I needed to reconcile these 3 transcriptions into one best version of a transcription of her handwritten poems. Next slide, please. Here you'll see an image of her handwritten poem, Simon of Cyrene. And using both the In Her Own Right archive and the Douglas Day 2020 transcriptions of the Anna Julia Cooper collection at Howard, the connection between one of Cooper's handwritten poems included in her personal papers and her efforts to get it published is revealed. Cooper's letters to Anna and Jackson reveal the larger personal and professional networks Cooper used to advocate for her own work and get advice from a close friend. Her intimate correspondence with Jackson highlights her vulnerability as a Black woman writing and teaching in an environment of powerful Black men like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who served as gatekeepers to Black writing and education during this time. But it also shows her strength and perseverance in telling the stories that she wanted to tell and working to support her own teaching philosophy about Black education. The work of digitizing and transcribing Anna Julia Cooper's papers, which includes her correspondence, her published articles, plays, poetry, and other ephemera, expands our understanding of Anna Julia Cooper's legacy as a public intellectual and educator far beyond 1892. and specifically being attentive to her poetry and its reflection of the Black experience or a reimagined Black history, Cooper's legacy is shown to expand beyond her non-fictional essays and speeches and into a literary creative realm geared more towards educating the Black community. Her efforts to get her work published in newspapers and in the Outlook magazine in particular suggest her intended audience being not just for an educated elite audience, but Black working professionals and Black youth. My presentations focus on Cooper's letters from the In Her Own Right digital archive, and the digitized and transcribed Anna Julia Cooper papers from Howard demonstrates the importance of the research I've done within the Black Women's Organizing Archive, a project housed within the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State, which seeks to bring together the scattered archives of 19th century Black women. By recovering the larger intellectual and organizational networks that Black women were part of and documenting the personal and professional challenges they faced throughout their lives, we can create fuller understandings of Black organizing women like Cooper, who were dedicated to improving the lives of their communities both individually and collectively. And I might want to end with just an excerpt from the Simon of Cyrene poem to showcase Anna Julia Cooper as a poet. So I'll read, quote, "Through all the petty nothings that keep mankind apart, these two a look all-seeing shot forth from heart to heart. Two spirits met each other at nature's tidal flood, the one a man of no caste, the one the son of God. A look, a thrill, a heartthrob, of comprehension clear, to find in one communion God's children far and near. The Negro's willing shoulder beneath the cross was thrust, the burden and the bearer no more shall be accursed. We two went up together, and they who love the Lord someday shall call me brother in memory of his word." End quote. And I will end there as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much to each of our presenters for those fabulous presentations. And I will just check to see if we have any questions. I see one question being posed, and please feel free to use the chat to pose additional questions. So one of the questions says, "I would be interested in hearing whether or how the presenters work together across their projects, or if or how they influenced each other."
I mean, I guess I can say something here, but and then Sabrina and Courtney could probably speak more to it. But I think, I mean, we kind of organized the presentations the way we did, in the sense that, you know, we needed to first collect these transcriptions before we could start to work with them. I mean, you know, obviously you could individually sort of search through documents, but once you get them transcribed, it becomes a lot easier to find specific documents, or even you know, search for specific words. And like I said, we're still doing a lot of that work of figuring out, you know, how we want to organize them and things like that. But at least it sort of as a, you know, example of what you know, that work could look like, I think is how we kind of tried to organize it, to go from transcription to some of that research, and I can let Sabrina and Courtney pick up from there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that just kind of behind the scenes work started when we were all on like the Zooniverse development team together. So Justin was chairing that, but Sabrina, I also helped him, and we thought through ways to, you know, recognize or affirm like Anna Julia Cooper's archives through just even like the smallest amount of data, which is like the metadata and all of that. And so our kind of journey towards this panel, I know for me personally, started with that Douglas Day 2020 event and our committee work together. And I think one of the most amazing experiences that I experienced was the day of event. That was like right before the pandemic, and all of us were there, and we were able to see the effects or impact of community, you know, on archiving this work. I mean, we went through archiving these transcripts pretty quickly that just first day. So just kind of like being in that community and, having the access, which is very important to Douglas Day and the work that it does, making things accessible, opened my eyes of who Anna Julia Cooper was and led to my own kind of presentation of looking at her personal life.
Yeah, and just to add on to what has already been said, which I second and third, is kind of even after Douglas Day. So my presentation specifically, I needed Justin's help to be like, all right, you have the metadata or like some of the transcriptions. Can I see the Excel sheet so I can incorporate the work that the contributors had done to kind of review these transcriptions and record them and kind of figure out what the best transcription would be to kind of document, like kind of go from the handwritten to like a more typed version for my presentation. But yes, I think just Douglas Day and my work has all been collaborative with both Justin and Courtney, stemming back from planning for Douglas Day, creating the crowdsourcing platform for our project, and kind of thinking about like, what can we do with this now that we have it? Yeah, I'll just go from there.
Thank you. I wanted to just actually say a couple of words because I really, obviously I'm familiar with the projects and with the work, but hearing it again today in this way really made me see the collective, but also individual kind of interventions that you are all making. And, when I was listening to you, Courtney, I was thinking about how you are really offering new ways of reading, new ways of being really attentive to reading differently these materials, right? And that can inform Cooper's archive, but that also can be a way of reading that is relevant for so many different Black women's writings, and even the way you put it in the context of sexual assault and the history of sexualized violence, that helps us to understand that this really translates across different archives. And then Justin, when you were talking about critical fabulation, critical fabulation in some ways is an approach to an archive and to thinking about how do we deal with the gaps and the inherent silences in an archive to create that, to create meaning and to recognize that we're always in this process of creating meaning. But you made me think about how the very process form of critical can be a form of critical fabulation as well. So, I mean, what an amazing approach to think about involving the participants in a practice of critical fabulation, and Sabrina, I was thinking about you in terms of working across the different archives and how important that has been, and how there's always new materials and how important a project like In Her Own Right is, because we've been doing work on Cooper for a long time, but it wasn't until we were searching this database that we uncovered additional letters. And those letters are so important in terms of like, well, then how do we put them in conversation with other archives and other letters? And so I guess my question would be, can you talk about what parts of the process have been kind of maybe most surprising or rewarding for you, as well as what maybe have been some challenges, things that you're finding like you're grappling with new ways of making meaning. And so what have been some of the challenges there as well?
I can go first if y'all are still thinking through it. I think one of the things that I found so rewarding is like some of like the detective work of being like, ooh, like I found this thing, like how can I connect it to these other archives? So like finding the 2 letters of like Ann M. Jackson, and just like helped me to have I guess if we're thinking about like recovering things that like within the archive that aren't necessarily represented, in my research with Cooper, there's like so much evidence of like all of the issues she found with getting her work published due to this gatekeeping, and to see evidence of her reaching out to other women to kind of get her work out there, and particularly to highlight the work that she's doing as an educator and an administrator, was really like rewarding. And so like it showed me how important this work is of like finding records of Cooper and like her papers. And I think alongside that, one of the challenges is like in searching for these types of evidence, because a lot of times they're hidden under other people's papers. And so you might not be able to just search like Anna Julia Cooper and like these types of things come up. And because she's sending letters to other people, then again, that would be under their archive and not her own. So kind of thinking about strategies to like recover her, like what keywords or searches to do, has been a little bit of a challenge, but it's a challenge that I'm enjoying doing and being this like detective almost. So
I guess an interesting thing that I have just found reading her archive through this lens is that how far it kind of it goes into like her life outside of the archive. And so I was reading through articles before I did this presentation of like, you know, reading her archive this way can impact how you even read her, just the way that she moved through, life. So even with her being buried in a certain place rather than being buried in like the colored, um the colored cemetery that was, it was pretty much built or established right after her husband's death, but she chose to place him and herself in the white section of the cemetery with like the foreign or stranger, people. So that could be read differently. And just even with just reading the biographies that have already been, did about her, especially Louise Hutchinson one, where she has pictures of what was found in her day room. And what really hit me right before this presentation was she actually had a painting of her um, enslaver, her father, house in her day room. So, just reading moments like that differently can show like how kind of influential her childhood might have been or her life. Now, the challenge that I come up with, especially with people, Justin coming up with critical fabulation and stuff, there's always the question of if these people were alive today, would they respect or want these kinds of projects being done on them? I think I grapple with that a little bit about, am I actually doing something for her that she would appreciate, especially how she, would write about herself in her own writings. And I'm hoping that it offers a way for historians and other people to just see another side of her rather than just the activist or the educator, the feminist, but how all of that is only possible through this kind of childhood that she, tried to write about, but it just never officially came out in a full narrative of things. So those are the things I found interesting and challenging.
I would say for me, probably the biggest reward was those conversations that I got to have on Douglas Day, and just really seeing that this history does matter to people and that people are really engaged with it, because you just don't get to sort of, coming up through school or whatever, you don't get to learn about really any of this stuff, and then to sort of take part of this whole, day of celebration where everyone's all together trying to uncover history and engage with it, and is just, very excited to be there and be learning, is just its own sort of reward, and something that, I've never really gotten to experience until then. And then, I mean, in terms of what's challenging, I think, obviously the technology side can definitely be challenging, and I'm still learning stuff with that. But I think specifically, we're just thinking about questions of what to do with the data at this point, as I alluded to, and still pretty open-ended. And yeah, I think just really figuring out, what are we able to do with it, and what do we want to do with it. And, like Courtney just mentioned too, sort of like what is going to be the most sort of like respectful way to do it as well. And so I think those are just, questions that it's going to take, obviously our whole team, and obviously we're just a part of the team here today, but it's really going to take everyone together to sort of figure those out. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like a broad challenge, but that's definitely the things that I think we're grappling with going forward.
Great, thank you. So there's a question in the chat. It says, might you talk about next steps? What does this lead to? And also about how this digital project or digital work fuels your own scholarship and research. And so you don't, all three of you don't have to talk about both pieces of that, but if you want to talk about some of maybe next steps, but also, for some of you, you're working really specifically in this area in terms of the content, but some of you may not be working on Cooper specifically. So how does this inform your scholarship or your research more generally?
I guess I can go again, since I will be the representative of this is part of the research that I'm interested in doing, with particularly kind of using the archives to reconstruct or to like kind of refocus what 19th century Black women were contributing both as intellectuals, but also as part of like larger communities, whether that be like with them being part of like Black women's organizing, as Black club women, but also like just the networks, like what was sustaining their work is something I'm really interested in, of like looking at their correspondence and like thinking, given like so many of the challenges during their time of like publishing, of speaking, of traveling, like what was their support like in that space. So that's kind of what my particular interests are, like where to go next steps is to like, in doing this research, kind of recover some of that to kind of think about like how can that help us in our own notions of what organizing means, and like what it means to do collective work with others. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I alluded to some of our next steps already in the talk. I mentioned, thinking about if we're going to do like a map project or just generally thinking about how we're going to exhibit the data. But I think one thing I haven't mentioned in terms of more in line with my own research is just thinking about data and I guess it's more even like metadata too, and how those categories of what data you want to collect really needs to be part of sort of the research. It can't just be something that you sort of take for granted, but really thinking about what questions do we need to be asking about these documents that are going to sort of lead us to best recovering them, because I think a lot of digital humanities up until this point has been very white dominated and not necessarily tailored to recovering African American history, and especially African American women's history. And so so as I'm starting to think about how I'm going to go into the archives and for my own research, I think that's a big question for me that this has helped me think through.
Yeah, I just want to briefly add, like everything, especially riffing off of Sabrina, I'm pretty on in my graduate work right now, but as I am getting closer and closer to where Sabrina and Justin are, I know especially that I want to center Black women and how they have had practices of memory and archiving and just being and living. And so this work that I did with Anna Julie Cooper, it's kind of like a practice for me, I guess, of like, how can I take the skills I learned, how to find these moments in her archives. And I'm really interested in women who are, living during the 1700s, enslaved in the Americas. And how can I do that, what I did for Anna Julie Cooper, and put it for them. And so all of, seminar papers and stuff has been me just kind of practicing that kind of recovery and, fabulative work that both of my panelists have talked about.
We are just about out of time. I just want to at least send a shout out to the last person who posed a question, even if we can't answer it all fully here. But The last question was about how each of you has talked about and underscored the importance of this kind of range of skills and approaches that are shaping African American women's history in the 21st century. And so just thinking about maybe one parting, I'm getting a message. I think I have a minute. We have time for one parting kind of comment on what advice would you offer to historians? And I'm a little leery of doing that, but what advice would you suggest as an approach or something we can take from this that is not just about like digital tools, but really about how does this approach help us deepen our understanding, or one thing we might take away from this that could help deepen our understanding of African American women's history?
I can say quickly just one concrete thing is that we sort of had to fight is maybe not the right word, but there was some debate over for the documents that were typed. Some people would say like, well, can't you OCR those, like, just have like a machine sort of read them and spit out the transcription. And we fought to say like, well, no, we don't want to do it that way. And I think one thing, like thinking specifically about African American history, I mean, they didn't always have access to the sorts of materials that were going to be able to be well preserved enough for to be machine readable. A lot of Cooper's documents that were typed were pretty well preserved, but we just talked to Cynthia Greenlee the other week. She was telling us about how there's not all archives are gonna be as well preserved, and I think that, and like I said too, I think by having people actually do it, there's a lot of history that gets uncovered in the process of people engaging with it. And so I guess my advice there would be like, you as the researcher should not necessarily assume that you have all the information or the best way to approach it, but really do need to bring this to the community and see what that bears.
I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to suggest this, but I will. I guess if I had to just say a phrase, would just like live in the undisciplinary. History often kind of looks down upon like speculative research and what people like Carly Peterson and Celia Hartman, they encourage people to do. But that, in the state of what our archives are as Black people, um, there's just infinite impossibility and potentiality of what you can do because of the silences, because of the absences. And so, if you are willing to be comfortable in living in that kind of uncomfortable speculative, space, you probably will get a lot of productive things out of that kind of research. And that's what I tried to do in this presentation, try to offer another sense that, maybe if we stay in that moment where she was, conceived, non-consensual conception, what can we do? What can we find in her writings? And so it seems pretty productive. So that would be my suggestion.
I guess definitely second and again third what Justin and Courtney both said. But I think one thing that I think is really useful is to, again, kind of not consider like, yes, there's a lot of like individual work that the figure does in terms of their intellectual work, but thinking about like, what is the collaborative work that they've done? How might they be influenced by the groups that they were a part of? So Justin in his presentation mentioned like the AKA sorority that like Cooper was associated with, and just like involving the community and kind of creating like a more well-rounded vision of like African American women, to like show like what networks again that they were a part of, especially because like the AKA sorority was the group that like recognized that Anna Julia Cooper, like her PhD, like getting her PhD at the age of, I think she was in her late 50s, early 60s, something like that, early 60s. And so just thinking about like their the groups that they were a part of and how that might be informing their work is something that I am, again, interested in, but I think is important to not just thinking about individual collaborations, or individual contributions, but also collaborations.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I've gotten to learn more from each of you, even though I know all of your work so well, but I really appreciate everything that you're bringing to this, the new perspectives, the new approaches, the critical lens that you've brought to this work. And also just to close by thanking Justin, Sabrina, Courtney, thank you so much for your presentations. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And also just to thank our team members who aren't here, our team members who were part of the Douglas Day 2020 project, but also our team members at the Center for Black Digital Research. We couldn't do this work without many, many, many people. And we just represent a small portion of that larger collective. So thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers, and enjoy the rest of your symposium.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Dr. Moody-Turner, and all of the panelists. This was an excellent way to close the day. I guess I should come on video too. I don't know if you all were here in the morning, but to bookend the way we started and to close with you all is just really fantastic. And I think a lot of energy for everybody who's been here. So we hope we'll see everybody tonight for Martha Jones' keynote, and possibly tomorrow, if you've got the energy to come back and join us for a lot more brilliance. So thank you all very much for being here, and you've really contributed a lot. And I too have learned a tremendous amount, and I have a lot of work to do with going to look at these papers.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.